Do you want to start there, or do you want to start with someone else? I don't know.
No, what we're gonna do as soon as we're going, and we are, we're gonna do this first. This is
Uh-huh.
the Cameron Journal Podcast. It's a place where we talk about important things. It's a place where we bring a little slice of the news to you. It's a place where we do important things, have important conversations. It's also things that I like to talk about. My name is Cameron Cowan, and this is the Cameron Journal Podcast.
Hey, this is Grady. All right.
Hello, everyone. My name is Cameron Cowan. This is the Cameron Journal Podcast. We're so delighted to have you all. This evening, we are going to do something a little bit new and different. This is not the weekly news podcast that we normally do. We're actually going to be talking politics and philosophy this evening with one of my new Instagram friends. As I said in the description of this, we have been on Instagram Live a couple of times. Um, we have we have had really great conversations and all this type of thing. And uh, I we just wanted to do something really interesting with something more interesting, more expansive, all this type of thing, and kind of go from there. So we're gonna talk about all sorts of stuff this evening. And I started the wrong event, but we're gonna do this anyway. Oh well.
All right.
And we're going to and we're gonna go from there. So I'm excited to welcome Jack Genocide to the Cameron Journal podcast. Good evening, sir. How are you?
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm doing good. How you doing?
Good. So, I want to first start out by giving people a little bit of background on
Hmm.
um kind of what we have talked about already and kind of how our ideological stances are so that people are not surprised and or scared when we are saying stuff. So, my listeners know
All
me.
right.
I'm a classical liberal. I consider myself pretty center left. People who've been with me a long time know I used to be a Republican. And this works well because Jack used to be a Democrat. So we just did a 1-for-1 exchange. And so it's kind of funny where I tend to be. I've found in our conversations I tend to be a little bit more mainstream, and you have a little bit sort of alternative views, all this type of thing. The other night you were talking about that the political philosophy that you would like to subscribe to has not been invented yet. So I think that is interesting and compelling. So people should kind of bear that in mind, that there are going to be areas in which we come together and agree very well. There are other areas in which we're not going to agree at all, and that will make for good conversation. Um, Jack definitely has more philosophy background than I do. So sometimes he can speak to that. I think he's dug into those texts more than I have, which is fine. I do the politics thing, and I have a policy and constitutional law and all this type of thing. So that's kind of where we stand. So this evening, I thought we would start with something that is timely, and we would start with the war in Ukraine. Um, there's been some kind of recent developments today. It looks like Mariupol is going to, what's left of it anyway, is going to fall in the coming days. The Russians have practically bombed the place into the Stone Ages, and and there's kind of this. On the one hand, people are saying the sanctions are not enough. Some people are saying the sanctions are nice, but they're causing inflation. They're ruining global trade. There's all these problems. There are still some people who say, no, we should invade. I have been saying, no, we should not invade. That will start World War III. That will be much worse for all parties involved. um, all this type of thing. So I wanted to get your feelings on the war in Ukraine, where you are with everything, how you feel about everything, and where are you with this situation?
Oh well, the memes are going insane with it, and on that level, yeah, it's very interesting. But yeah, I don't know. I guess ultimately my optimism is for the emergence of challenges to um, the Atlanticist empire, or you could say to neoliberalism, kind of, or to basically the to NATO, to the alliance, and to the economic alliances represented by NATO. WTO, IMF, EU, and like what is represented by American interests. So like the emergence of Russia as something that is standing up to what we're trying to do in the world, what America is trying to do in the world, what Europe is trying to do in the world. Obviously, it's horrible. War is horrible. I'm not gonna say that it's a good thing. And it's actually emotionally, it's been very difficult for me because it's like I feel like I want to sympathize with the Ukrainians, and yet I feel like every time I'm being called to do that, there's this kind of, especially when I'm watching the news or something like that that's covering this, there's this call to then agree with the kind of, liberal agenda about, just sort of demonizing Putin, turning Putin into Putler, the new Hitler, and just sort of, the sort of grand narrative that's the magnet pulling me into this. But I do sympathize with the Ukrainians, and obviously, like Putin is, a very violent threat to a lot of people. So he's not. I don't see him as the hero in this either. It's just the narrative of villainizing him has been very prominent in my life, and like I've been encountering that a lot, and so I'm sort of pushing back against that, but also being aware of this is basically like this is the empire versus another empire. It's not, there's no rebel alliance in this, there's no like good guys, there's no Captain America in this.
Yeah, I find it interesting when you talk about that and the alliance system and all this type of thing, because there's been a lot of talk about the end of the liberal world order. Before I launch into a full-throated defense of those institutions, what is it about this kind of transatlantic nexus of like NATO, EU, IMF, WTO, World Bank that you find so problematic?
um well, hmm, I the way I see it, I've been indoctrinated into that empire, so I'm like a good citizen of the new Rome in a sense. But there's a kind of there's a general sort of belief that, oh, I don't know. To me, there's like this pull to a kind of a choice of faith, like a kind of a choice of like, do I believe in the values that I'm aping, the ideals that I'm aping, the ideals that I'm trying to, that I'm at least like representing myself as believing, or do I want this comfort that is given to me by modern day capitalism, modern day democracy, and yeah, so um, I tend to be on the side of that. All of that is worth sacrificing for what I see as the truth, what I see as like what I truly believe in versus what makes me feel good, or what makes me what's more likely to guarantee my protection, my safety, etc. And I think that that is something that philosophy has been trying to like Heidegger, sort of, but it goes back all the way to Kierkegaard, talking about the choice to sacrifice a child for God, and like God putting, believe fuck I always get mixed up with the Bible, which was that Abraham? No, I'm probably getting that wrong.
Sacrificing his son Isaac in
Isaac, yeah, yeah,
yes, yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Yes, that was Abraham. Yeah.
Yeah, like I feel like that's the call, is like this kind of like everything that I love, everything I'm comfortable with versus what I believe in. And everything I'm comfortable with is the American Empire, is the Atlanticist empire, its institutions, the modern day capitalism that gives me the streaming services and comic books and video games that I love and everything, versus what I truly believe in, which is not necessarily in an alternative to that already exists, but just that it needs to be that there's something rotten at the core of that empire, in the way that it kind of combines a seduction through pleasure and a demand through basically tyranny, basically authoritarianism, and basically pushes people into a position where they have to do what it says, or they want to do what it says, and against what I see as the truth, against what I see as like their true beliefs, against what they, and that I am pressured on a daily basis to pretend represent myself in a way that is contrary to what I actually believe in, just for survival, just for like day to day acceptance. So I guess I turn to an alternative as a kind of, I can see the light of that alternative, as opposed to the darkness of the kind of stagnation that I see in this empire.
All right.
I don't know if that was completely coherent, but
No, no, it gives me something to work off of. I can see where that is. I can see where there's some ideological difficulties there. It is always difficult to be in, to enjoy the products of something while not enjoying the system that it comes from.
mm-hmm.
And I think particularly as people of color, we're always caught in that conundrum in like every area of our lives,
Yeah,
sort of thing.
right,
We're dependent on the very system we're trying to change. Well, that's not always so easy. That's a very difficult thing
right,
to accomplish.
right.
When it comes to the international situation, at the same time, though, it is I don't think I think the human suffering of pre-liberal world order chaos is nothing that nobody really wants to go back to. What's happening in
Mm.
Ukraine before World War One was a fairly common sort of incidents, because
Mm.
even if you go back, as nearby as the Napoleonic Wars, when France, literally subjugated 2/3 of Europe in less than a decade. Um,
Mm.
this caused a great deal of human suffering, problems, and all this type of thing, and there was very little obligation on behalf of neighboring powers to do anything to stop it until they became directly threatened. And it was
Mm.
a great lesson of, if you had stopped Napoleon when he was taking over, what we now know as Austria-Hungary and northern Italy, South Central Europe, marching towards Russia, all of Eastern Europe, all this type of thing, you would have never had the Battle of Waterloo. And the only force that was able to defeat Napoleon was a force that literally took 6 nations, their entire militaries, to even begin to slow him down and finally bring
Mm.
the Napoleonic Empire to an end. And that's a lot of money. It's a lot of people. It's a lot of everyday human civilians getting caught up in the trading and going of political things that they, at the time, of course, did not understand or hardly comprehend. And I think one of the great accomplishments of those institutions in the 20th century and this was the point of them, was to try to get off that cycle of sort of constant political conflict, particularly in the European continent. And I think this
Mm-hmm.
war in Ukraine is emblematic of the fact of how important those institutions are, and to some greater or
Yeah.
lesser degree, are the general failure of us to include former Soviet republics in them, and we now see the result of them. So while I
Mm.
too might have some complaints about what the World Bank does to developing countries in terms of financing and trapping countries in debt, which is a huge problem, they're particularly bad about that in Africa. I might complain about what the IMF did in East Asia after the Asian financial crisis, all this type of thing. I would still rather
Yeah.
have institutions in place who can try to solve political problems before they become violent wars rather than
Mm-hmm.
not.
Mm.
I mean, I guess I don't necessarily look at it as like, yeah, the system is nice to live in, all this type of thing, but it's a problem. I kind of begin to take issue with people who try to call it, you know, an empire or imperialism. An empire or imperialism is expansionist. There's subjugation involved, all this type of thing. I don't really see, well, World Bank and IMF to the side, because one could make an argument that their behavior is somewhat colonialist. In fact, I wrote a paper in grad school
I,
called The New
I would focus on
Colonialism. Yes, I mean, I wrote a paper
it.
called The New Colonialism, so we'll put the banking sector
Yeah. Okay.
off to one side, which leaves us with, like, the UN, NATO, and the EU. I don't view those three institutions as being particularly imperialist because people have to vote and volunteer to join them. If you don't want to be involved, you
Mm.
don't have to, and there's no threat of a military coming to force you to join the EU. The Europeans just don't care that
Right.
much. So, so I kind of view I kind of take issue with this whole idea of it's kind of this, you know, this imperialism and it's two empires fighting one another because these institutions have far more freedom than anybody enjoyed under the old colonialist empires. So how does that strike you?
Yeah. Well, are you familiar with Antonio Negri and Michael Hart's book Empire?
Yes.
So what they're basically proposing is that it's not empires anymore. It's just this one singular empire that's represented by like basically just capital, like the capital as it flows throughout the world. And there are these things outside of capital, like Al Qaeda, that are
Yeah.
trying to they're part of. I mean, they're partly intertwined with it. They have their own kind of black markets and stuff like that. And I think that sort of model, which focuses on things like the IMF, it focuses on economic. And to me, going back to what you were saying of like the institutions that have prevented these wars since World War I, I think I have much less faith in those institutions preventing these wars, and I have much more faith in mutually assured destruction preventing these wars and nuclear weapons and the existence of nuclear weapons and the threat of nuclear weapons. And I think that this is an example of mutually assured destruction being tested by Putin. Putin is basically saying he's basically playing chicken with mutually assured destruction to advance his own interests. And every step of the way, people in American media are talking about, hey, let's start a no-fly zone. That won't be a big deal. We'll just shoot down some Russian planes. It's not no big deal. Like and they're also trying to play chicken with mutually assured destruction. But I think that mutually assured destruction is basically from Nagasaki, from Hiroshima on, that was the new world order that we're dealing with, and these treaties, these organizations, they are absolutely yes, they are negotiating, yes, they are trying to prevent wars, yes, they do have impact to a certain degree, but when it comes down to Putin, like he's giving the finger to all of them, and the only thing that's really stopping him is the annihilation of Moscow and of his bunker wherever that's hidden, and like all of his secret little hideouts or whatever that the CIA probably knows about. His own death, that's the thing that's preventing him from rolling into Poland next and just taking that over.
Yes. I mean, yes, to some degree, the threat of starting World War III is keeping it's keeping NATO from doing more. And
Right.
I've made a full-throated hour-and-a-half video about why a no-fly zone is a bad idea and why an invasion is a bad idea. I am
Mhm.
personally surprised at how unpopular that position is. I have been
Mm.
DM'd. I
Yeah.
have been personally yelled at. I have been attacked for,
Hmm.
by people who are, and all, the other thing that worries me is the casual nature of people saying, well, why not? Like, the nuclear threat's going to be there anyway. We should save Ukraine. And I'm saying, you know what was going to kill a lot more Ukrainians? B-52s carpet bombing Kyiv to drive the Russians out. That's going to kill a lot of Ukrainians. People, I'm like, you saw what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, okay? Like, we killed tens of thousands of civilians a day. We have much nicer, more powerful weapons than the Russians do, which means we can kill civilians all the faster. Again, call Iraq and Afghanistan. They'll tell you all about it. And I don't see that as being productive. And the other problem is it then gives Putin an easy excuse to raise the stakes. And it gives him a very
Yeah.
easy excuse potentially to start either a limited nuclear war with tactical nukes in Ukraine or possibly something
Hmm.
bigger. And then all these
Yeah.
conversations go away because there's not going to be a planet left for us to argue about. We'll have nuclear winter,
Right.
all vegetation will die in 10 years, and human civilization as we know it will be gone.
Well, then
Um,
we get our great Poseidon's revolution.
well, the only people having a revolution will be tardigrades and cockroaches. They'll be able to form a new society. Um, I think the
You know
only potential
Poseidism?
upside, the only upside I think is global warming will be solved because that nuclear winter will probably trigger a small ice age. But it's from the dust in the atmosphere. But it's so maddening that there are so many people who are so hawkish
Mm.
about starting World War III all of a sudden.
Yeah.
That surprised me.
Yes.
When I took an anti-World War III position, I anticipated like most of my readers would agree with me, and I was amazed at how many people
Mhm.
thought I had taken leave of my senses. And
Yeah,
I mean,
that's scary. That's
it's very
screwed.
frightening.
You know.
Right. So circling back to what you said when you talk about like the only real force we have that does anything on this planet is the idea of mutually assured destruction. I would agree with you. That certainly has been a factor in geopolitics since the Soviets got the bomb in '49. And every country
Mhm.
that has gotten a nuclear weapon since then has upped the ante on that. More players in the nuclear
Right.
club. And oftentimes we've taken
Yeah.
great pains to keep new people from entering the nuclear club, a la Iran,
Hmm.
North Korea. There are some countries who left the nuclear club, like Ukraine and South Africa. Um,
Hmm.
but I I am still it's still a very dangerous game to play. If that's the only
Yeah.
nexus on which global politics turns, you need only look at
Hmm.
the Cuban Missile Crisis to see how very dangerous that game can get in a very short period of time. And that's
Yes.
in my mind a history worth reading about because particularly people our age, we didn't necessarily grow up in our childhood with the constant threat of nuclear war like our parents did. It wasn't because I
Right.
was 3 when the Soviet Union fell apart. I actually vaguely remember
Mhm.
Christmas of 1991. Like one of my very first memories is Gorbachev on television talking about how the Soviet Union was no longer, and
Mm.
so and I'm a mid cohort millennial, so most of us have grown up. If you're under 35, I'm 34 next week. If you're under 35, you never really grew up under that. Whereas 35 and above dealt with that fact. Even people like my
Mhm.
nana who grew up in the 50s and who thought they might have children but didn't think they would have grandchildren because the Cold
Mhm.
War was much hotter in the 50s than it was in the later decades. And
Right.
so I mean I agree with you. I think that is the nexus on which geopolitics does turn, and it's certainly turning in this conflict, but that's also very dangerous. And that's where I think having institutional structures is better than just relying on the fact, well, they have 6,000 nuclear weapons, we have around 4,500, and no need to talk further because, you know, we can just exchange
I agree
data
that
and
it
have a
would be
normal
better if
conversation.
it would be better if we could if our institutions were powerful enough to stop our enemies. But there's no I mean there's no negotiating with terrorists. There's no negotiating with Putin in this kind of situation. There's no there's no we're at the table with the Chinese. We're making deals with China. But at some point they're going to do something about Taiwan, and I don't think the UN telling them don't do this is going to stop them. I think this is very possibly a trial run of what will happen between China and Taiwan. The only difference being that um, we are in a position where we basically are supposed to defend Taiwan. But I feel like that's more negotiable than a lot of people want to admit. I feel like that when the chips, when the shit hits the fan, basically, we'll let them kind of roll over Taiwan. But I could be wrong. I'm probably being optimistic, and that's I hope that we don't just start a war with China.
Yeah, I mean there's a lot. I mean, that I think has been the comparison in this situation that has been most apt. Is
Mm-hmm.
people saying, does the global response to Russian aggression in Ukraine deter the Chinese from going after Taiwan? I think it does and it doesn't. Um, Keeping with how the Chinese do things, they will watch what happens to Russia and they will learn from it. And they will try to
Right.
insulate themselves from the same consequences that Russia has suffered under when they want to do Taiwan. And I think that's
Mm-hmm.
also important because Xi Jinping has said that he's not going to let Taiwan wait till the next generation, which means he probably wants to do something about it, probably before the end of this decade. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and the thing to watch for with China Taiwan this fall, the Chinese Communist Congress meets in Beijing. It only meets every 5 years, and Xi Jinping will announce China's new 5 year plan. And it
Mm.
will be interesting to see how big of a priority Taiwan is in their 5 year plan. Because if
Right.
Xi makes a big announcement of, um, it makes a big announcement of how, of wanting to do Taiwan in the next 5 year plan, we can presume that they will at least attempt it sometime between 2023 and 2028, which is,
Mm-hmm.
as I said, would be on track to try to do it before the end of the decade. And I was listening to Morning Joe this morning, and Admiral Tavridis was on, and he was saying, you know, there's the West has many fewer tools to deal with China than they do with Russia, and I agree.
Mm.
The only leverage you really have is that China's economic situation is hopelessly dependent on exports. China does not have sufficient domestic consumption, which means if you cut China off from the rest of the world, it's going to be very difficult for us in the West. We'll not be getting any new cell phones or
Yeah.
laptops for quite some time, but China's economy
Right.
will be collapsing with nowhere to sell their goods and no longer being able to be the world's workshop. But I also know, given how we're redomesticating manufacturing due to the pandemic and all that type of thing, that lever
Mm-hmm.
may not be as big 5 years from now. We're building a semiconductor plant in the United States, in Texas. There's stuff moving to Mexico. There's stuff moving to Latin America. There's even stuff moving to Canada. And so that lever may not be as big, and so on the one hand, you have us wanting to bring things back to not be dependent on everything coming on a boat from China. The Chinese are going to want to be
Yeah.
less dependent on exports to the West. And this is kind of an exemplary example of Frederick Bastiat, who said, troops do not often travel over borders where goods do also. And
Mm.
this is a situation where, to some degree, conflict between the United States and China has been inconvenient for both parties. If that should
Yeah.
change, all of a sudden conflict becomes a little bit more convenient, less costly. And as the cost of
Mm-hmm.
conflict goes down, the likelihood of it goes up. And I
Mm.
agree with you. I think that
Yeah.
China's going to be looking at this whole situation very carefully. And when they look to see what it looks like in invading Taiwan, they're going to have to make some very difficult calculus. And I think a lot of it is going to
Right.
be the matter of which political parties in power in Washington.
Hmm.
You know,
Well, also, yeah, and also, what that made me think of is if we stopped getting those cell phones and PCs and everything, where would our politics go in that kind of scarcity economy? Like, who's going to get elected in America in that situation? Probably not. Probably somebody worse than Trump. but
yeah,
in terms of Taiwan and its politics, it's interesting to me how um, and it sounds like you're probably more, you probably know more about China than I do, at least in terms of its internal politics and everything. But it seems to me, from what I've talked to, people who are supporters of China, people who have family in China, it seems like their dynamics are split between liberalism as an economic liberalism versus the Communist Party and people that are supportive of the Communist Party. And there are liberals in the Communist Party, but there's like the kind of party line heads that are just completely devoted to making strengthening the party and disciplining these corporate forces and throwing CEOs in gulags and everything like that, versus the liberals that basically want China to become like the US or like Europe, but to basically to outcompete us, and to do what we're doing better than we do, basically. And Taiwan is an interesting case of that because they're obviously, on the liberal side. They're technically part of China, but also they have all these freedoms because they're politically antagonistic to them and politically aligned with us. But they also, historically, it was a shift from a kind of monarchic dynasty, that was the reactionaries who fled after Mao's revolution, and those are the people who flipped and they became liberals. And that examples of that type of thing, similar to what happened in England. It's like the some of the most evil dictatorial tyrants just sort of flipped a switch, and then they became liberals, and they're pro democracy, and they're pro this new set of allegiances and everything. And I'm very sympathetic with China. I mean, not I mean in Minecraft, not actually. Like, don't at me, CIA. But I'm very sympathetic with China against the Taiwanese dynasty, that against Chiang Kai-shek, and his brutal kind of drug running empire that
Chiang
he
Kai shek was
established with.
genuinely awful. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a piece of shit, and like,
Yeah.
he started
No,
this.
people don't realize how much Mao's ability to come to power in China was based on how Mao's people were just way nicer than Chiang Kai-shek's people. Like, it was, I
Yeah.
mean, in terms of like Mao had this whole regulation about being respectful, cleaning up after yourself, all this type of thing, and Chiang
Hmm.
Kai-shek was just like burning villages, killing children, all this type of thing. He wasn't exactly a great
Yeah.
ambassador for democracy, let's say. Like, that
Yeah.
was, yeah, yeah. So yes, I mean, I
Yeah.
it's but see, here's where I think China made a misstep. If China had
Hmm.
handled Hong Kong differently and
Mm.
proved that two systems, one country worked, I think they could, because Taiwan had a vote about rejoining China 2 years ago. I think China could have made a much easier thing of saying, hey, Taiwan, if you come back, we will respect your democratic norms. See how we did it in Hong Kong. See how we let Hong Kong let democracy work so we could be one nation, two systems. And they didn't.
Mm.
They crushed Hong Kong's throat. And that made the Taiwanese be kind of like, well, clearly two systems, one nation is total bullshit. Like, like screw that. Like, we're not, screw you,
Yeah.
China. We're not going to do that. I mean, that was a huge misstep. They could have safely, with a plebiscite, annexed China, or annexed Taiwan, rather, without a shot fired if they hadn't been so brutal in
Mm.
Taiwan. Or, I mean, in Hong
Mm.
Kong, rather. Like, it's kind of, and it's odd because the Chinese are usually more patient and calculating than that. Usually.
Well, they were very
Yeah.
patient and calculated. They released COVID from the Wuhan lab, and solved the Hong Kong problem. I mean, not really. That didn't actually happen, but you know,
Yeah. No,
like,
I mean, it's No, I mean, I was just telling someone, it's funny you should say that because I was just telling someone last night. I said, it's amazing how the Wuhan lab leak started out as a kooky conspiracy theory and is now like an acceptable idea by lots of very serious people. And it did that in a year, because so much
Yeah,
evidence came out in support of it. And I think
right.
what's really telling, and I said this early pandemic, I said, if it was accidental, that's one thing. God help the Chinese if it was intentional. Because if it was intentional, this will cause a war. Pandemics cause wars. I have an episode of the produced episodes coming up called Opium, Opioids, Pandemics, and Wars, where I talk about the opium wars in China. And
Mm.
I kind of tie it into COVID-19 and all this type of thing. The script is not done yet, but I'm going to try to have it out this summer,
Okay,
before I leave for the East. And
interesting.
and I said, if China did this intentionally, God help them, this will cause a war, and that war
Who-
will almost immediately be nuclear. Like it's from both
Oh, why?
sides. Because
Why do you
well,
say that?
it's a simple matter of geography. We are far away from China. The Pacific Ocean is a big place. China will want to get
Mhm.
an advantage early on. If it ever comes out that China did this intentionally, the American populace will demand a response. The entire of Western civilization will demand a response to this to punish the
Mm.
Chinese. And it might not necessarily be ICBMs flying across, but I think a tactical nuclear weapon won't be out of the question. China will want
Hmm.
to sink as many of our 12 aircraft carriers as fast as possible because that's the best way to protect power, especially because they have one aircraft carrier they bought from the Russians that doesn't work. So they're going to, they're going to want to level the playing field as soon as possible. And the best way to get rid of, I mean, aircraft carriers are massive. They are floating cities. There are 5,000 people on
Right.
there. That's the size of, I mean, the town I grew up in Arkansas didn't have 5,000 people. So it's
Mm-hmm.
going to be, I think, a little too easy for the Chinese to not want to fight a conventional war. They know they will likely lose, and they will want to up the ante as
Mm.
fast as possible. To some greater or lesser degree, and I've said this as well, I think there were people even in the Trump administration that knew about the lab leak thing, and they didn't want that necessarily to come out, but it came out anyway. I think
Yep.
it is a situation where it is in the best interests of the United States for the intention, if China did release it intentionally, and I'm not saying they did, we have no evidence to that, but if that ever came out, it would almost be within the national security interests of this country to make sure that fact never comes out, because if it does, it will start a war.
Right. Well, I I think I'm even more pessimistic because I would say that the currents, the flows, the waves of the narrative around COVID have already mitigated that threat. Like it's already, even if we know that they did do it intentionally, totally on purpose, that will be rendered basically a conspiracy theory, especially because
Yes.
of Fauci's connections to the lab. Basically the people that would be the ones getting enraged and saying we need to nuke China are the ones who will be getting enraged and telling you, no, you're a conspiracy theorist, you're a kook for even speculating in that direction. And both our media and their media are pretty good at programming mass people to basically shut those types of ideas out as even potentials because the the CCP is working for the people. They do things in the name of the people, and they're working for us. Why would they try to kill us on purpose? Why would they release a deadly virus to their own people? That doesn't make any sense. They love their people, and same thing goes for the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, etc. Like they're all the media is manufacturing consent for these institutions so efficiently that we'll never really sort of interrogate that problem in that way.
Yes, and I think this is an example of something. Here's what we do know: something went terribly wrong in Wuhan, and there are now 20 million people dead. We have lost more people to
Mm-hmm.
COVID than troops lost in both the world wars. We have lost more
Mm-hmm.
people in this country than we have lost for every war since Korea. So that's Korea, Vietnam, Grenada, Beirut, you know, Iraq, Afghanistan, Kosovo. I mean, this is a lot of. I mean, we're always constantly at war in this country because that's what, one of the few things we do well. And
Right.
and so that's a lot of people. And people talk about even economically and all this type of thing. Why we have a labor shortage and all this type of thing. I said, well, we've just had a mass disabling event. We just killed about 1.2 million people, and a lot of women have had to leave the workforce due to childcare. There's no wonder there's a labor shortage. We've lost a lot of workers
Right.
out of the economy. That's pressing wages higher. And I don't think we framed the pandemic in a way that's like the last 2 years we've just been through conflict. Like, I think if
Hmm.
like in during it was like after World War I, there was a total economic reset on both sides of the Atlantic because so many people had died. 5 million troops plus civilians had died. There was a complete economic reset. Wages increased,
Hmm.
all sorts of things changed. In Britain before World War I, the largest industry was personal service. After World War I, it was manufacturing. The same thing happened after World War II, just a simple loss of life. And we don't frame it in those terms because it doesn't seem like we've been in a war. But the reality is that from a dead bodies standpoint, this has been a global conflict of sorts with all the requisite economic changes that come after such a huge event that goes on for as long as this has gone
Hmm.
on. And so when we say, why do we have inflation? Why do we have labor shortages? All this type of thing. It's like, we've been through it, and it's going to take some years to unwind this. And I tell people, I said, over the last couple years, we've done America's greatest hits. We've had the Civil War, the Great Depression, Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement. Like,
Right.
we're just on stage playing the hits, like, of all the things that
Right.
happen. I said, so with all these things happening all at once, you don't think that's going to change every facet of American life? I'm
Hmm.
sorry. If you don't think that all those things happening at once isn't going to change lives, I have a bridge in Brooklyn to sell you at a great rate, like with easy
Right.
financing and great credit.
Yeah.
Um, so that's that's I don't think we talk about this the right way. So when you talk about manufacturing consent, I would agree with you because I know you always have a lot of issues with
Mhm.
narratives, and so do I. I agree with you. The narrative about the pandemic, the government has never gotten that narrative right. They've consistently screwed it
Right.
up. And even now,
Hmm.
the narrative is still not in the frame that it really deserves. We're not talking about
Right.
the pandemic as big of a change to our society as it really has been.
Hmm.
So,
Right.
yeah, something went bad in Wuhan and the world changed. But we don't talk
Yeah.
about it like that. Why do you think that is?
Definitely.
What do you think is wrong with the pandemic narrative? And why do you think we're not
Um.
talking about it in the frame that it really deserves?
Well, the most kind of creepy thing for me with it was people getting into it, people getting into the pandemic, and I feel like I had an aspect of this because I played a lot of like post-apocalyptic video games like Fallout, and watched a lot of movies like Mad Max and Resident Evil and zombie apocalypse. The whole zombie apocalypse meme about 10 years ago of like, what do you do? What will you do in the zombie apocalypse? So you get a shotgun and like stand on the top of a building, or like what's your zombie apocalypse plan? That whole thing. That all kind of like ideologically trained us to, when this went down, fetishize things like masks in a way where it wasn't really so much important of like how effective they were. I mean, it was important. That is important. I don't want to die on that hill, but that like there was a kind of a post-apocalyptic chic, almost like the post-apocalyptic style and the aesthetic and like of virtue signaling around like, oh, I'm doing more to stop grandma from dying than you are, and like that, all that kind of stuff, and sort of it. I mean, yeah, politicizing it, it becoming this division as opposed to just strictly saying like, I'm going to do what I can to stop people from dying, and and like, and so there's this debate in philosophy between two philosophers. One of them is Giorgio Agamben, who is he's very connected to Michel Foucault and like postmodern philosophy. It's between him and another philosopher who I always forget the name. Is it Braddock? I think it's Braddock. I could be getting that wrong. But basically, there's on one side, Agamben from the get go was arguing that this is the state of exception, essentially. That, like, as soon as this pandemic breaks out, we're in a state of exception where your democratic government can suddenly behave like a dictatorship and it has the free reins to do that. And historically, every time that a government was given that kind of leeway, Caesar being like the best example, they seized upon it and took over and basically installed a kind of at least a temporary dictatorship or a temporary situation where if you were an enemy of the state in some sense, your life was significantly different than it would have been under freedom. And on the other, so he is arguing that this whole pandemic situation is making us less connected to one another, less of a community, more afraid and more paranoid, and in a constant state of distancing ourselves from one another, while being subjugated by this greater system that claims to be acting in all of our interests, when really it's using that to serve its own interests, its own sort of inhuman will of just power seeking more power. And on the other side of this debate, I want to say I think it's Bratton. I think it's Benjamin Bratton. I want to say. I mean, I'm probably just totally forgetting his name. But his argument is that COVID has now created a situation where we have realized that ourselves no longer matter, and all that matters is this kind of disconnected, alienated collective that to be yourself is in some way unethical, because to be yourself, to try to worry about your own individualism in any way is basically a threat to the greater whole, and the greater whole isn't you and your community even. It's just this kind of like cybernetic link between you and everyone else. And I think that he has a very like horrific alien kind of like cyberpunk dystopia perception of the world. And that's really the horror to me of this pandemic, is like not your form of liberalism, I think, is much more human. His is like totally, it's totally postmodern in a sense where it becomes not even really about humanity anymore. It's just about this bare life of like, we need to preserve this system that is theoretically saving some old people and some disabled people, etc., from this virus, and everything else needs to be sacrificed for that. Everything else needs to be sacrificed for that. And any call to a return to an older norm, to earlier freedoms, anything like that, is basically just evil, and is basically you're sacrificing, you're killing grandma, that in a very like I went on a long tangent there, but like it's basically between um wanting a better society and this fear of killing grandma. Those are that to me is like the distinction, and this fear of killing grandma has led to the worst types of behavior, in my opinion.
No, a year ago, I would have not been happy that you said that. I might have
Mm-hmm.
ended the talk because I didn't want that on my air. I'm very, no, I'm very serious. I'm very serious. I take what information that my name goes on very serious. Always, always and
Okay.
forever.
Yeah. Yeah.
And but in the past year, I've watched the narrative go wrong. I've watched the
Mm-hmm.
government's response, which I thought would get better under Biden, get worse. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I've watched Trump. I've watched two presidents bumble through this pandemic. I've watched,
Yeah.
a patchwork of local regulations, some of whom do make sense, some of whom make absolutely no sense at all. I've watched government policy claim to be quote unquote reactive to the science, and then I read a scientific paper and I'm kind of like, you're not reacting to any, I don't know what science you're doing, but you're not reacting to any science I'm reading in places like the
Mm-hmm.
Lancet and a Journal of and JAMA and Journal of American Medical Association, all this type of thing. And so a year ago, I would have been furious about someone saying that. And I mean, I guess I've progressed or regressed, depending on your perspective, to a place where I absolutely agree with you. It was all. I mean, there's been
Mm,
a lot of COVID theater going on. There's been a lot of performative stuff going on that I don't think has been a huge mover on the pandemic. I was,
right.
one of those people not too long ago that was like, oh, yes, we need to get vaccinated and we need to wear masks and we need to social distance and do all of the things and this is a smart idea and blah, blah, blah. And now it's come
Mm,
out that it's like the lockdown, we literally shut down the entire planet to not solve COVID. Remember 2 weeks to flatten the curve. It's been 2 years.
mm,
Um, and
mm,
and with terrible economic consequences. People have died of many
right.
diseases because they were unable to get surgery and treatment. And we don't count those as
Hmm.
COVID deaths, but we really should, because, if COVID hadn't happened or had been handled differently, they wouldn't have died. And we
Hmm.
also have found out in the course of things masks don't really work in a lot of situations. Most people aren't using the right kind of mask that might work in some situations. And, wearing a
Right.
mask for longer than a half hour, maybe 45 minutes at the outside, they lose effectiveness rapidly after that point. Which means if you have
Hmm.
children sitting in school all day wearing masks, their protection basically drops before their first class is over.
Right. Right.
So it's something where I'm kind of like, if we're supposed to be following the science and doing all the good things, I dare say we left that territory a long time ago. And so, and it's kind
Definitely.
of funny because now I feel like, it's kind of like cut me a slice of humble pie. Those people saying that from the beginning, why are we doing all this stuff? It doesn't really matter. The number of people dying is
Right.
comparatively, not that much, all this type of thing. And, and so, and
Hmm.
now all of a sudden, even a lot of my, friends who were all liberal follow this. I mean, I live in downtown Seattle. My congressperson is Pramila
Hmm.
Jayapal, who's the chairman of the Justice. So these are the people I live around. I'm like at the center of like American liberalism. And all of a sudden we're all be kind of like, those Trump supporters had a point. Like,
Yeah. Right. Right.
suddenly we're coming around the barn being
Yeah.
like, they might have not been so wrong about things after all. Like we should have treated them nicer. Like, hubris will get
Well,
you
this is
every
why I
time.
say
Like,
this is why I say that the political philosophy, I would support hasn't been born yet because I borrow very extensively from Marxism, and I also borrow a lot from reactionaries and libertarians, and like far right people and stuff like that. Like something like that. I totally at the time I was in the same place you were. I was like, these people are fucking crazy. They're trying to they're trying to pretend this isn't happening, but then we wait a year and it's like, oh, actually, maybe Florida got it right. You hear Bill Maher saying Florida got it right.
yeah.
AOC is going to vacationing in
Sweden as
Florida.
well. Sweden didn't lift a finger to really do a whole lot about the pandemic. And the people
Mm-hmm.
got so mad because their neighboring countries it collapsed the Swedish government. And now we're all
Mm.
looking around and being like, actually the Swedes were on with the right idea. And China
Yeah.
proves you can't go zero COVID. They're about to drive the whole country into the
Mm-hmm.
ground trying to get to zero COVID, and it's not going to happen. Europe
No.
basically
Yeah.
gave up. Europe was basically like, we've done everything we can do, back to normal life. And in this country people are
Mm-hmm.
mad that like, oh, we're, like the mask mandate on planes was struck down by a judge yesterday. And this is kind of started turning into the weekly news podcast, but it's was struck that down yesterday. And there's people on Twitter being like, oh my god, this is so unsafe, I have a 22-month-old baby who can't be vaccinated, all this type of thing. And I said, ma'am, your 22-month-old is most likely not going to get COVID. And even if your baby does get COVID, the chances of them dying from COVID, let's put it this way, you took a greater risk stepping onto the airplane to begin with. I hope it wasn't a
Right.
737 Max,
Right.
like, all this type of thing. So, I mean, I was having a conversation on Sunday. I said, at this point, it's like, I'm triple vaxxed. I took my life in my hands more driving on I-5 to get to their house than I did of catching COVID. I mean, we have terrible
Mm-hmm.
traffic here in the Pacific Northwest. Like, I mean, it was more dangerous for me to drive on the highway to get to their house than I was from getting COVID. And I think, and to some degree, I think, a lot of people who from the beginning said none of this stuff makes any sense, it's all a dumb and terrible idea and all this type of thing, as it turns out, time has proven them to be somewhat, in certain situations, correct. And
Right. Yeah.
I find that both difficult and disheartening on the one hand, but it also makes me question the decisions of people over the last several years. And I think when or if this is all over, we need to
Mhm.
ask some very tough questions of some very particular public officials. And I was never on
Oh
the
yeah.
whole Fauci's a terrible person train, all this type of thing. And I don't think he's a terrible person. I think he definitely tried. But I think, to me, it's like the fact that the Democrats are not having hearings in Congress on the actions of the CDC during the pandemic is terrible. It's time for some good, old-fashioned, soundbitey congressional hearings. I feel like a lot of hard questions need to be
Hmm.
asked because it's like, we did all of these things and it seemed to not move the needle. And now the only thing that has is the fact that we have vaccines that are quite effective. And we now have a whole host of treatments. The pharmaceutical companies did what they did best. They went into their labs. They made a bunch of treatments. And now you don't have to die from COVID. It's not a death sentence. And the thing
Right.
about it is, but here's the sad thing. You wouldn't know that. There's 4 drugs to treat COVID now. Not a headline
Hmm.
from the Times about that. Not a
No.
headline from, and I'm talking both New York and Seattle Times. Neither. Nobody
Right.
has mentioned the fact like we have drugs to treat this now. Your chances of dying from COVID are the lowest they've been since November of 2019.
Right.
And we're just not having those conversations. And I think to
Yeah.
your point about borrowing from both the left and the right and all this type of thing, I think there's a lot of people who are on that boat. And I think the pandemic has become that halcyon moment of people realizing we need both. We can't exist in uncomfortable binaries that don't make sense. And the pandemic
Right.
has brought that to the fore.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a sad
Um.
situation. Sorry, that was very
Definitely.
long. I apologize.
Definitely. Oh no, you're good. Maybe we can shift to talking
Of
about the
course.
left and the problem of what I see as the problem of the left.
Yeah,
Um,
drop it like it's
because
hot. Tell me
I've
where your head is at with that.
well, I feel like the left is um part of what Gammon's talking about with these systems of control and everything. That the left is this kind of disciplinary machine. It's this kind of disciplinary mechanism that is, and I guess this is the problem of any political constituency because the right has a similar type of discipline mechanism but the way that it has been used by say Twitter kicking Trump off or something like that, or the COVID narrative being seen as the left, as the right wing likes to call it, the lib pandemic, or this issue with Ukraine and kicking RT off of the American internet, basically making them unaccessible. All of this and cancel culture also on a micro level. I see it as like it's like your I was on the left for a very long time, for like most of my life, and really up to this year. But like I was, like up to like last year. But like I see it as like I was struggling to be perceived as having the right points of view in a way that, like, all of a sudden, when I just sort of stopped trying to be on the left, I still believed most of the same things, but it was like I'm no longer worrying about how I'm being judged. And all of a sudden, something like I became a cafeteria Catholic, essentially, of leftism, of like, oh, I can be pro abortion and, I can not pray every day, or it's like, or I can be anti-abortion and not pray every day, or whatever it may be. Like that, there isn't that there are these dictates, and there's this kind of like social judgment, social pressure, and this if you're trying to especially be an activist, there's a certain way that you're supposed to be perceived. There are certain certain perspectives you're supposed to have that like tick certain boxes in order to fit into this this machine, this mechanism and institution, basically. And yeah, to me, it's like I am not. I see the right as like also very problematic, but I don't see um, the same kind of judgment. I see their machine works in an almost opposite way of like basically bringing together everybody who's against the left, whether it be a libertarian or a evangelical Christian, someone who or like people who've left the left, or like or somebody like Candace Owens, or nationalists, all or fascists. All these people are they're all part of the right because they're all responding to what the left is doing. And the whole concept of being a reactionary tends to be that like progress is going in a way that you don't like, and so you're going to react. And it doesn't really matter who else is in like they all have their own infighting, they have their own debates, but they all kind of join together behind somebody like Trump because Trump represents as a God and man at Yale, said like, standing in the way of progress, crying holds. Like it's it's not about stopping you from believing these things. It's about stopping the progress that we see as a problem, basically. Not to say I'm on the
Yeah.
right, but
No, I mean, I would say, I would have, I think the first kind of, I want to circle back around to cancel culture and deplatforming because those are things I have written
mm-hmm.
against. And I definitely, that is not a popular position to take. As someone who's center left and tends to have a center left audience, there are people who do not like that I say, oh,
Yeah.
deplatforming doesn't work, and the way cancel culture treats people is rather tawdry, and we really shouldn't do that because it alienates people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I want to go on the idea of when it comes to trying to halt progress, and again, I think this is a narrative problem.
Mm-hmm.
The right seems to wish for an America that no longer exists,
Right.
and I I don't understand why they're trying to hang on to it. I'll admit,
Mm.
I get the racial nervousness. That's not new in this country. That's existed since Reconstruction. Okay, that's I get that. But when it comes to things like gay marriage, abortion rights, all this type of thing, and this kind of gets into ideology, which I think is an interesting conversation for this. I don't understand
Yeah.
why there are so many people, particularly on the right, who seem to be dead invested in making sure that we certainly don't move forward, and nay, dare I say, we go backwards. That doesn't
Mm-hmm.
make a lot of sense to me because it's against their own self-interest. And it
Mm.
seems like people are willing to do bad things for themselves in order to serve something else, and I don't know what that something else is.
Hmm. I just want to go back to the '90s. I don't know.
We were in this
I'm
trip
like
for a long
Cypher
people.
in the Matrix. I want them to put me back in, make me an actor, make me somebody important. Just
Yeah,
make me forget everything. Let me
I
forget
mean,
everything.
yeah,
you know?
that's. I mean, that's why. I mean, I think it's, and this is where in a very Heideggerian way, language is so revealing of underlying
Mm.
ideology. The slogan is
Mm-hmm.
"Make America Great Again." The
Mm-hmm.
implication of that being America's no longer great, which then begs the question: why is that? For whom is it not great? Even though by every metric,
Right.
life today is better than it was in 2000, we have made tremendous progress in the last 20 years. Economically speaking, things are certainly more difficult than they were in the 90s or in years past. That has to do with globalization and free trade and a whole bunch of other factors.
Mm-hmm.
Go buy my book if you want to learn about that. And a new edition
Okay.
coming soon. Um,
Hell yeah.
and all this sort of thing. I don't I think that's something. I mean, I'd be interested to see from your perspective, why do you think there is this impetus for people like Trump, Ted Cruz, Mitch McConnell, the whole gang, to stand in the way of
Mm-hmm.
progress and say no, we can't do this? What do you think's really behind that?
Um. Well, in terms of again, it goes back to narratives. And I think that a certain critical narrative was kind of dangerous. If you look back at underground journalism, underground art, punk rock, the messages and the narratives that were being asserted then versus now, you still have punk rock, but it's already won in the sense that, not to say that we've abolished capitalism or anything, but that basically it's now, it has gone from being an underground narrative to being basically a universal narrative that capitalism is bad, that corporations are evil, that American imperialism is bad, that America did bad things, that and it's gotten to where basically any given leader historically you can basically point to can be ridiculed and demonized, and people can destroy the statues to them, and basically form a whole narrative that our everything in our history was terrible, and therefore the only time where anybody's doing any good is now, when we are going to abolish everything that came before and usher in this new world order or whatever, bring out with the old, in with the new. And to me, yes, I mean, I get what you're saying about the obvious racist undertones of "Make America Great Again," but I think that there's also an undertone of like, of this desire to have stories told about America that are about it being great, and I see that in like Clint Eastwood's sort of bad movies that he's done over the last decade and a half. Gran Torino being the best example. In comic books, there's this whole movement called Comicsgate, where the people, there's one guy who's like done a comic book about like cops who are the good guys in the riots in 2020 and stuff like examples like that. Like the yes, there's like a really, I think there's that book needs to be analyzed as like a piece of like fascist art, as just like it needs to be psychoanalyzed. But I think the underlying, if you get past the racism, you get past the reactionary, what 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 he's striving to do there in that pretty bad work of art is basically establish a narrative about good Americans trying to do the right thing. And you can still write that story, but it's like almost in the mainstream, it's like good Americans trying to do the right thing is good Americans standing against America. And maybe that's, I mean, like I said, I don't like empire, I don't like what we're doing, I don't see us as the good guys on the world stage, but I can understand feeling that evil of it, and wanting to see it in a better light, wanting to, and also being constantly told how terrible we are, wanting to see that wanting to see that in a better light, and wanting to write a story about that isn't as terrible and doesn't make it out that me and you are terrible. I always think of Marxist third worldism.
Mm.
Are you familiar with Marxist third world?
Yes.
It basically says that, like, even if me and you are communists, we're still evil because we're in the first world. We're bourgeois. We are bought out by capital. We have been bribed by the great empire. The only thing that we can do that would ever reverse that is basically become agents of the Chinese state and like undermine and like commit acts of terror in America in Minecraft. That would be the only way we could possibly redeem ourselves, is by like destroying American society, because basically we're tools of the devil, essentially.
Right.
And maybe that's true, but like if I was that, I would want to write a story where I'm not seen in that light, and I tend to kind of buy into this multi-narrative postmodern idea that like there's multiple stories. There is the story where I'm the devil, and there's a story where I'm an angel, and the story where I'm kind of complicated, and I kind of prefer the one where I'm kind of complicated. But the Trump supporters want the one where we're the good guys, and that's always been an American thing. We've always wanted stories about Americans. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is a story about Americans being the good guys, and that there's something there. I'd really love to talk about that with you, actually.
Yeah.
If we could circle back to that,
Yeah, no.
but
Well,
go
this
ahead
is
and address.
I'll take us there because I wrote an essay in my first book called "The Death of the White Christian Heteronormative Narrative,"
Mm,
and I identified this problem. As I said, we're right now we're trying to change the national story, and national stories don't change very easily. It
right.
usually takes very dramatic events for the national story to change. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and and you see it with Germany and how the Holocaust kind of hangs around their necks like an albatross, from which they will not be redeemed for centuries, um,
Mm-hmm.
and that is a difficult thing, but it takes something of that level to change the national story. And right now we have this national story happening where we're trying to shift towards being reflective and self-critical of ourselves and trying to undo the mistakes of the past, racism, economic inequality, all this type of thing. So yeah, when it comes to Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, that definitely is kind of and I think Quentin Tarantino played into that whole idea of America classic, like Coke classic, America classic sort of thing.
Right.
um
Mm-hmm.
you know let's not talk about the new Coke, let's talk about the classic stuff, and how back when we were when we were the good guys, we were on the right side of things, and we didn't have all these pesky problems like LGBT issues and race issues and all this type of thing, and we could look favorably on
Mm-hmm.
ourselves and not be so self-reflective. um
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean, how do you think that narrative switch is going through the lens of film?
Well, to me, my interpretation of it, and this is coming from a lot of other people that have interpreted it, so I'm not. This is not original at all, but particularly the use of Lena Dunham as a member of the Manson family.
Mm.
I think that they were. I think he's deliberately um, drawing a line of connection between cancel culture and the counterculture of the '60s,
Mm.
and demonizing it by basically connecting cancel culture to Charles Manson. And then he's also, with the use of the flamethrower, spoilers, but the flamethrower that is used at the beginning of the film to kill the Nazis, and then used at the end of the film to kill the Manson family. He's drawing a connection between cancel culture, the Manson family, and the Nazis. And of course, Manson was, he was somebody who put a swastika on his forehead when he was in prison, connecting himself to the Nazis. But I think that the film is. The recent sort of rewatching it like a week ago, I sort of came to this conclusion that it was like it's the Beach Boys versus the Beatles in a sense. It's the Beatles are the one, they, I mean, both, and oddly enough, the Beach Boys, Brian Wilson let Manson into his house for an extended period of time, and he like trashed it, and he basically had kind of sold him on this idea that he was going to get him into the music business, and that might have inadvertently led to him committing the murders that he did because he was getting revenge against the people that had promised him all the, I mean, who knows what was going on in his psycho mind, but that the kind of idyllic picture that the Beach Boys paint of America and California and the '60s versus this total subversion of all of that that's presented by the Beatles, and then the rock and roll from that point on, psychedelic rock followed by punk, heavy metal. All of this is progressing toward undermining all of that, getting rid of all of that, going beyond all of that, versus just sort of staying in that idyllic surf rock utopia of the California beach scene, and yeah, and simple life, childhood in a way. But yeah, I think that they are. It's very important in his films that the characters are underdogs. It's a stunt man and a B actor, and they're trying to get into that scene of Sharon Tate and what's it, Polanski. They're trying to get into that scene, and it's by killing the Manson family that he finally is allowed into that world. He kind of finally crosses the gates at the end of the film into like this kind of heaven of the Hollywood that he always dreamed of, and that it never got invaded by this countercultural force. And so that is a
And there's
kind
a
of like
difference of
deeply
aesthetics there, isn't
reactionary
there?
film.
Yeah, well, but there's
Mm-hmm.
also a difference of aesthetics, and you see this in American fashion. If you look at the fashion of the late '50s and
Mm-hmm.
early '60s, the clothes are tighter, thinner, very thin ties, tight clothes, very European, which was trendy at the time. Short haircuts, very
Mm-hmm.
clean cut, no beards, all this type of thing. You see that with like the Beach Boys, Monkeys, all this type of thing. And then once the British invasion
Right.
happens, fashion goes nuts with colors,
Mm-hmm.
patterns, hair gets long, particularly on men, um, all this sort of thing. It's a complete shift. And so from an aesthetic point of view, it was so discordant because in the even with rock and roll the late 50s, early 60s, all this type of thing, it was something that older people might find annoying but could be passed off as acceptable. By the mid 60s,
Right.
it was now no longer acceptable. It had breached that point of acceptance by regular society, and this is when it becomes
Mm-hmm.
this sort of counterculture thing. And even like if you look at the posters of the time at all this type of thing, the whole idea was if you can't read this poster, then the music's not for you, sort of thing. Because
Yeah.
Bible fonts had come in by this time and all this type of thing. And
Mm-hmm.
it kind of went, it was kind of thing where you took something that was kind of the kids, that was new and young and sort of all right, and then all of a sudden becomes this undercurrent of subversion. So I
Mm-hmm.
think even from an aesthetic point of view, it's quite interesting, that total shift. And then by the early 70s, you start to see that become a little bit more mainstream, but it's still kind
Yeah.
of. But you also see, with like especially like in 68 to about 75, like Nixon and then the post Watergate years and all this type of thing, the reactionary nature to the cultural subversion, that because you ended up with this aesthetic getting tied to civil rights and Vietnam protesters and all this type of thing,
Mm-hmm.
I think even the election of Nixon not only was a political reaction to how chaotic the country was in 68, and the country was very chaotic in 68, but
Right.
also as an aesthetic sort of thing of wanting to go back to when things were more acceptable and more palatable. And I always
Mm-hmm.
say, that was the thing with Kent State. It wasn't just that the National Guard was shooting college students on American soil, it was the system trying, basically saying through violence, this has to stop because it's going to tear our society apart. And ultimately, the system
Right.
won.
Yeah.
Ultimately, because
Yeah.
literally in between Kent State and Vietnam protesters, in 8 years, Ronald Reagan gets elected. We think of those
Mm-hmm.
two events as being incredibly far apart. The reality is they're not that far apart. And you had a lot of
Right.
boomers who had been totally into that whole counterculture, all of a sudden about 1981 decide they wanted to be their parents.
Right.
And all of a
Mm-hmm. But
sudden
I think
they
also.
yeah, they ditched the clothes, put on a suit, and made a lot of money. A lot, a
Mm-hmm.
stupid amount of money. And then by the mid 80s, having money became cool. All of a sudden, having, the Flash went from long hair, a fur coat, and bell bottoms to a new BMW, a lot of brands that nobody had ever heard of before then, and all this type of thing. All of a sudden, the cool was be successful and be rich.
Mm-hmm.
From an aesthetic point of view,
And
that's one
but
hell of a transition. I mean, I'm just saying, in 30 years,
right.
that's one hell of a ride.
But they kept the values. They kept a lot of the values of they. I think that like the Clinton administration was like the kind of final victory.
No,
Thatcher
yeah.
said that her greatest victory was Tony Blair ultimately,
Yes.
because the neoliberal values that she believed, that she had been aping, that she had been putting forward and implementing, all of a sudden the opposition had accepted them fully.
Yes.
All of you suddenly had an opposition that was completely for everything economically, that she was supporting, but that on some cultural level, or basically had found other issues to disagree with, but they were accepting the same neoliberal values as her. And I think that was the Clinton administration, who, you look at the old pictures of Hillary Clinton, she was a hippie, like she
Yeah.
was totally a hippie boomer. And I think so. Russell Brand, that's a whole other topic. But Russell Brand recently did a video where he quoted this book. I think it was the Rise and Fall of Neoliberalism, something to that effect. But he talked about the '90s as this very important decade where you saw this battle between what that book calls the neo-Victorians, on the right, and the cosmopolitans on the left. And the cosmopolitans wanted gay rights. They wanted more rights. They wanted to support black people. Oddly enough, a lot of these people also supported the gun bill, and
Right. Yeah. And mass and the
calling people
things
like
that
us
resulted in
super
mass
predators.
incarceration.
But,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But they culturally sort of virtue signaled that they were anti-racist and pro women, pro LGBT, all these things. Not in, maybe, or at least pro gay at that time. While the neo Victorians basically said that they were for conservative values, going back to the old America, etc. And yet economically, Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton basically supported the exact same things. They basically wanted the exact same agenda, and that agenda won. It dominated. But while it was dominating, they got to have all these little debates about what about choose name your issue. They could debate these things, and it's very similar to the way that this liberal YouTuber Ivan Shady Existence that I watch sometimes, he's from Russia, and he sort of sees himself as like an armchair Russia expert, basically. And the way that he depicts politics in Russia is that you basically have all these little factions. You've got your neo Nazis, you got your communists, you have Dugin with his fourth political theory and all this stuff. You have the hardline Putin supporters and all that stuff. They all debate with each other. They all have these little disagreements. That disagreement is shown to the public, but then at the end of the day, they all basically agree Putin is right. Putin will persevere. Putin is for all of us, and then Putin just enacts what he wants to enact. We've just replaced a dictator with the dictatorship of capital, the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, which is the neoliberal order. So it's, I mean, like I know you'll have contention with me totally equating those two things, but I think on some level of just like living in a dictatorship, I think we absolutely do. It's just that dictatorship is like it's the Terminator of the capitalist death drive has replaced any kind of a human actor, and maybe we'll eventually replace that with just AI and AI manipulating algorithms of the stock market.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily go so far as to call capitalism a dictatorship. For me,
Okay.
that's a bit of a bridge too far. But when it comes to neoliberalism being the only economic theory going out right now, you're absolutely right. Adam Curtis has talked about it. I've written about it. A lot of people talked about that. We haven't had a decent left-wing economic policy in this country since the 70s, and there isn't
No.
really one on offer. I mean, hell, it was new news when I was involved in Occupy Wall Street at Occupy Denver when we were talking about income inequality. That phrase is something that at the time was new, but it had been used before in
Mm-hmm.
the 1930s when labor was
Mm.
fighting for the first rights for labor, and which included 8-hour work days and weekends and all those sorts of things. And talking about pay of CEOs and trying to do income tax to force reinvestment, all this type of thing. And people forget during the American high that the Trumpists or so would like to go back to, top end tax rates in the 50s were 95%. Even under Reagan, top end
Mm-hmm.
income tax was 70%. That didn't really start to
Right.
go down till the 90s. you know
Yeah.
and Ronald Reagan raised taxes 11 times, in across
Mm-hmm.
8 years.
Right.
And so that is something where I think there's a bit of discordance there as well. Certainly, the dominance of
Mm-hmm.
capitalism has adversely affected our politics. That's just a
Yeah.
given at this point. But I don't necessarily. I think we do definitely need other economic ideas and some real economic discussion, which is why I said, and I said this on a live at one point, that uh that we have this sort of the sort of narrative difficulty in this country that we don't we're not having the economic discussion that we should have. The only time I've ever seen an economic discussion happen that mattered was between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders in 2016. because Hillary Clinton was doing an
Mm.
excellent job of defending the Republican Party while seeking the Democratic nomination, and Bernie Sanders was for the
Right.
first time in probably 80 years articulating a left-wing economic policy that American people
Hmm.
have not heard since their great grandparents in some cases, grandparents for some of the rest of us.
Yeah.
I said at the time, I said, that's where the debate should be. The problem is we're
Hmm.
having it in the nexus of the Democratic Party. We're not having it between the Republicans and the Democrats. And this
Right.
is a moment where it'd be nice to have a more multi-party system because,
Hmm.
as AOC famously pointed out, her and Joe Biden should not be in the same political party. Far from it. And in
Right.
literally almost every other democratic system on the planet, they wouldn't be in the same political party, because they have very different
Right.
ideas about how economics should go. And people, on the farther left and the progressives get mad when Joe Biden says nothing will fundamentally change. Well, of course not. Joe Biden is from Delaware, backed by insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies, who's invested in neoliberal capitalism. The only people who are really
Mm.
invested in trying to move away from neoliberalism is younger people, millennials, which basically me, and Gen Z, which is basically anyone under about 40, maybe 41,
Mm.
42 if you're a really early millennial sort of thing. And part of that has to do with
Yeah.
us trying to undo the economic mess our parents left us. And
Right.
I think it's I think this is emblematic, to your point, of a rather broken political debate in this country, that where we fight about gay rights and abortion and all this type of thing, when it's like, we have bigger fish to fry. We have bigger fish to
Right.
fry. I'm sorry, we have bigger problems to worry about. Our
Yeah.
lack of and then this is where my
But
leftism comes out. I say, why are we not having a conversation about public housing? Why are we not having a conversation about better social programs? Why are we not having a conversation
hmm
about having a more progressive income tax brackets? Why are we not having more conversations about federal funding for education or curriculum standardization, all this sort of thing? That's where the conversation should be at. I could care less if someone's gay or not. I could care less if you go get an
Right.
abortion. If you don't like an abortion, then don't have one. I can be arsed. We have bigger things to worry about.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But yet, our
Definitely.
90% of our
Definitely.
political discourse happens on issues that really are not the purview of government. Really, at the end of the
Right.
day, are really not the purview of
Yeah.
government. And the government really should probably stay the hell out
Well,
of.
yes. The AOC issue, I agree that, like, if this was in a European country, she would be in a completely different party than Joe Biden. But unfortunately, that has to do with, like, my issue with the left is that I feel like the left is basically universally a recruitment tool of the Democratic Party, which is the
Mm.
Republican Party at this point. So
Yes.
it's like you're telling people you're a Marxist, or you're telling people you're a social democrat or whatever. You're voting for AOC. You support AOC, all this stuff. But then at the end of the day, it's vote blue no matter who. And if you say anything positive about Trump, I hate you, and like I will hate you and demonize you and try to get you fired from your job or whatever, and call you a racist and all this sort of stuff, and basically do discipline for the Democratic Party while denouncing it and saying that we need to go past the Democratic Party. But there's no way to go past the Democratic Party within the system, at least without doing so. Like Jimmy Dore is a perfect example. He tries to like
Mm.
talk about another party or something like that, or holding these people accountable, but all of his methods basically involve taking the Bernie coalition, the Bernie campaign, people who worked for the Bernie campaign, and getting them to do things that are totally antagonistic to their career trajectory. Like it's in their
Yeah.
best interest to just become wonks in Washington and like get the best job they can. But he wants to turn them into something that would actually be useful against the Democratic Party when they're just part of the Democratic Party. And that is, I don't want to get into a huge debate about dictatorship. I just want to nail down exactly what I meant by that.
Mm.
Marx defined a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie as essentially a situation where they have the monopoly of power. The bourgeoisie has the monopoly of power. All that democracy is basically doing in our system is legitimizing the goals and agendas of the bourgeoisie, and basically acting as a middleman between capital and the people. The people are basically we're basically a not us, but the concept of the people is basically just a kind of a simulacra. It's just this kind of a mirage that is fought over, and you have these people acting in their own interests, supposedly acting in the interests of the people, and they're always being manipulated by capital. They're always being bribed by capital. They're always being manipulated by capital. And to me, I think we have a much more corrupt system than a typical dictatorship, as I've talked about in our lives before. Is you have a fully distributed form of corruption here, where my neighbor down the street, who's a politician, and the governor, and the president, and the mayor, they're all subject to basically bribes. They're all manipulated by major corporations. They're all being steered by moneyed interest in the interest of basically whatever those powers want. They're being manipulated, and their opposition is being manipulated. There's nowhere you can go. There's no party you can vote for that isn't being manipulated in these ways. And so that dictatorship, and the dictatorship of capital, is also that there is no option for you to, as a worker, to just check out and still be able to eat and put food on the table and pay rent or any of these things. You absolutely have to participate in capitalism, or else you're homeless, or there's no like something like UBI would be the beginning of getting out of that potentially. But even then, how do you maintain that UBI? We're basically in a no exit scenario where capital is the only option, and capital is absolutely dominant. That's the dictatorship of capital.
No, I can see that. I think there are off ramps. I think we have a lot of trouble accepting those off ramps in this country. I've
Mm-hmm.
always been very impressed by the success of Spain's worker driven cooperatives that make
Yeah.
everything, that do everything from grocery stores to make electronics, all this type of thing. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I've always been impressed. There's pockets of it in this country. There's a bakery that's a worker-owned cooperative, and the guy who runs the place only makes $70,000 a year, and everybody shares in the profits and all this sort of thing. And it's
Okay.
funny. I was watching a documentary. Upton Sinclair, who exposed the meatpacking industry in the after World War One,
Mm.
he ran for governor
Mm-hmm.
of California in 1932, and the movie studios spent $2 million, which at the time was a fortune, on making sure he didn't win because he wanted to turn the movie studios into worker cooperatives that the actors themselves owned. Now, bearing in mind all the familiar
Mm-hmm.
names that started movie studios are still alive. Like, Warner Brothers isn't a brand. Jack Warner still ran the place. Metro Goldwyn and Mayer were
Right.
all still alive running MGM. And these guys got together
Mm-hmm.
in kind of one of those Jekyll Island sort of meetings, in some smoky lounge in Los Angeles, and said, we've
Mm-hmm.
got to stop this guy because he's teaching agricultural workers in the Central Valley how to own the farm and to keep the money for themselves. Heaven help us if the actors start doing that here in town. And
Right.
they spent a fortune to crush this, because during the Depression, people were looking for off-ramps to the
Mm-hmm.
system that no longer worked. And they were finding
Right.
them.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the thing that I think people forget, and I've always kind of wondered why it's been so hard to get that going in this country, is we have off
Mm-hmm.
ramps. You can
Mm.
we could have more workers cooperatives. We could pool worker resources together to buy companies from those that own them and own those off ramps are available to us to this day. You can go out and start your new,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes you see especially in groceries and food, starting, food cooperatives, worker owned sort of things, all this type of thing. There's even worker owned t-shirt shops, all this type of thing. I used to have a higher one. They were very inexpensive. I have to say, they were cheaper than the capitalists next door. And
Mm.
so there are those off ramps are available, but I think what's mysterious is in this country we don't seem to ever use them, and I've never understood
Mm.
why. There's some hesitation about, like, people are almost afraid to leave the system behind, So to your point, when you say it's a
Hmm.
no exit scenario, I do kind of agree with you, because even if the door opens up where you can leave hell, no one's walking through, sort of thing. I mean,
Right.
we're having to cheer that
Right.
Amazon workers are finally unionizing. I'm like, that's the least that the workers should have at Amazon. That's that's
Hmm.
not even stage one. That's like stage point five, like, sort of
Right.
thing.
Yeah.
That's yeah, and it took them long enough. Starbucks, 25 years, and
Right.
y'all finally decided, hey, maybe we should get together and collectively bargain. What the hell? Um,
Hmm.
you know, but people are afraid, and that's what boggles my mind. Is we have some tools and we have some levers. We're too afraid to use them. That's frightening to me,
Right.
because it means it's going to
Yeah.
be incredibly difficult to get people off capitalism.
Hmm. How did you feel about Chop in your area?
Oh my goodness, that was I got back to so I was living in the East Coast in Washington D.C. area. I
Hmm.
got back here in September of 2020, so I got here kind of right at the end. So I had a chance to kind of
Okay.
see it at the end. I got to see a lot of videos and whatnot from my local contacts who were sending me stuff, and it was on. I was posting it to the Cameron Journal and across social media and all that type of thing. But I did get to see it before it was closed down. It reminded me of a much less organized Paris Commune of 1875. Um,
Hmm.
in terms of, I think it was one of those early attempts that if we ever break away from the current system, that will be one of those moments like the Ludlow massacre that helped spur the labor movement. It's going to be one of
Hmm.
those things where it's like, yeah, they were on, they couldn't get it together, but they were on to something. They seized six
Hmm.
blocks of a major American city and held on to it for 3 months and tried to start
Right.
something new and something different, and tried to say, no, we're not doing this anymore, and we're going to throw the police out of this area and all this type of thing. That's sometimes how it starts. You know,
Yeah.
the French Revolution started on a tennis court, where what was
Mm.
left of the Estates Generale was meeting to try to have a constitution to check the absolute power of the monarchy. That moment is forgotten. The tennis court revolution is mostly forgotten
Right.
because it predates the Committee on Public Safety, but that was how it starts.
Mhm.
I'm hoping it will inspire people to look for those off ramps, to find
Mm.
those ways out, to find ways to shift the system so it benefits the most people it can. But
Mm.
I think unfortunately in this country it's going to be very hard to do,
Right.
because of
Yeah.
John Steinbeck's temporarily embarrassed millionaires syndrome. I
Right.
think we have to. I think there's a identity here we have to seize again. We have to re-seize that identity of the not the collective so much, but like the workers, the people, and by people, when I use that word, I'm saying those who do not benefit from owning assets and capital, those who derive their
Right.
wealth from labor. We have to re engage with those identities of, I do not
Mm.
own assets, I derive my wealth from labor, and I should be able to do so in a fair way that benefits me because I have intrinsic value as someone who provides labor. We have not had that
Mm.
conversation in this country since the 30s, maybe the 60s. There was some leftists in the 60s who were talking
Mm.
like that. But we haven't had that conversation in this country in decades, for all the reasons you so
Yeah.
brilliantly illustrated out. So we're having to rediscover what we once knew. Three
Yeah.
steps forward, two steps
Yeah.
backwards.
Yeah. And well, part of that is the issue that you address is like total lack of class consciousness. Like it's not
Yes.
it's and total like and like what you were saying about the whole thing of like focusing on cultural issues instead of economic issues, and getting caught in this whole debate. It's partly because people are so hopeless that it's like something like abortion or you know critical race theory or something like that. That seems like something feasible, tangible, that both sides feel like they could get what they want done, and it feels like there's a real struggle there versus something like defeating Amazon. That seems like wrestling with a Titan.
Yeah.
Um, uh, you ever play the game Dark Souls
No,
or
I've
Elden
I've
Ring?
not. No, no, no. That's
Both
not
of
really
those
my
present you
gaming
with just like
wheelhouse. Yeah.
gigantic bosses that are impossible to beat.
Yes.
You're fighting a giant and you hit it and you do about like this much damage on a huge health bar. Like that's fighting capitalism. It's like you're
Yeah.
you're fighting these like giants and dragons and stuff, and like you just like are hopeless. You're just getting crushed over and over, and that's that participating in that struggle makes you want to fight over something smaller, and watching it from the sidelines and seeing how hopeless it is, seeing Occupy get crushed or something like that, seeing Antifa. Oh, that's actually something we could actually go into a lot. I was part of Antifa, and I think that had a lot to do with my current sort of political perspective on things. Is sort of seeing and also watching people that I was connected to with Antifa respond to the pandemic, and that very dramatically made me see that, like, oh, these are the people that are like acting like cops about COVID when they were the ones who were fighting cops a couple of years ago. but
Right.
but seeing that movement, seeing that basically all these people that I knew they're all against capitalism. They're all against the current state of things. But they were basically beating up poor people who happened to be of a certain political constituency that was opposed to theirs, because that's easier, because that's a target you can just go for, rather than trying to overthrow the most powerful system that's ever existed on the face of this earth. It's like, do you want to fight that giant of capitalism, or do you want to beat up some douchebag who does throws up a Roman salute? It's like, which one's easier? Punch a Nazi or punch the system?
Well, and that is, I think, I think one of the kind of whiplash moments of the pandemic. And we'll begin to close on this. We've been going almost 2 hours. It's 20 minutes
Oh
to the
yeah,
top of the
yeah,
hour.
yeah.
But I mean, so we'll probably our last topic. But I mean, yes, it is. I found it interesting how, especially those to the left of me, um,
Mhm.
suddenly were like invested in the system because of the pandemic. And I realize that's a survival instinct. I get that. Okay,
Right.
cool. But it's kind of like, let's not pretend the system's on our side, folks, because we know they're not. And we were all saying that any moment before March of 2020. Okay? Like let's not
Right.
pretend that these people are the great magnanimous ones to whom we should, give all our obedience and allegiance to. It is okay to question them. And it was interesting because I like watching the Dark Horse podcast, which has
Mhm.
Heather Haying and Brett Weinstein, who's the brother of the two brothers got thrown out of Ever
Oh
State
yeah, yeah,
College.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, Brett
Mhm.
has his and his wife do this great podcast, and I was
Mhm.
amazed. I posted randomly at night on Twitter, not like an official Cameron Journal thing. I post one of their podcasts to be kind of like, oh yeah, they have like a really like smart things to say that are critical of the health system and how we're doing with the pandemic. And this is early pandemic days, so I'm like, we can do some things differently and better. And they really led the charge on the lab leak theory. They were one of the first people to
Mhm.
come out and say this doesn't look like anything that exists in nature. We have questions.
Mhm.
And I literally,
Mhm.
there was somebody on Twitter I talked to over mentions every single day, unfollowed and blocked me because I just dare mention the name. And I I was surprised because all of a sudden on the left and to those left of me, all of a sudden it wasn't okay to criticize the system. And I'm like, wait a minute, that's what
Right.
we do here. You have follow. I've been doing this
Right.
for 8 years. First as the Cameron Cowan Show,
Yeah.
then as the Cameron Journal when we relaunched in 2018. I have been complaining
Mhm.
about the system this entire time. I'm not doing anything that
Right.
I haven't done the whole time y'all have been here. And yet, when it
Right.
came to the pandemic, if I dare speak a word against the system and what it was doing, all of a sudden I was the bad guy. And to really
Right.
kind of bring this conversation full circle to where we started at 6 o'clock, is that, all of a sudden, all these people were all of a sudden being like, oh, we have to, believe in the system and trust this and trust that. And it's just kind of like, that's literally not what we were doing last week. Like,
Yeah.
it's an odd sort of thing. It's a very odd sort of thing. And I think it's difficult to,
Yeah.
even in a situation where one is in danger, to keep questioning, to keep asking questions, to stay curious, all this type of thing, and to be open to that things might be different and it's a fluid environment. And if there's any one thing that I think is very difficult, is that we've been unwilling to be fluid. Both sides have concretized their views. And when both sides concretize their views, it's very hard to have a conversation. It's very hard to write public policy in that space. And I've been complaining about that for about a decade. Like, how
that's
how
part
can
of why I
we
enjoy
write public policy when both sides are concretized? We can't. It is no wonder government gets nothing done, because we're concretized.
Yeah. Well,
What
that's why I enjoy
way?
talking
Sorry,
to you.
folks. Like,
Yeah. Well, we disagree about a lot, but we ultimately, we've been mostly, even if we, I'll go off on a tangent or whatever, but we're basically coming to common ground about all these issues despite our disagreements. And that is something that has been kind of deleted from the discourse. We're now operating in this kind of a friend-enemy distinction of, like, that's what I was talking about with the left, is like people are testing people to see if they're a friend, testing people to see if they agree on this issue, you agree on this issue, you feel about this way about these people, or whatever it may be, as opposed to trying to have a conversation where you reach common ground. It's about figuring out whether or not this person needs to be canceled or something like that, needs to be rounded up or and gulagged or something like that, basically, or socially gulagged or whatever it may be. But like, we get past that friend enemy distinction, we can start recognizing that there's a lot of people on that enemy side who agree with a lot of the stuff we believe in, and the real enemies have a lot more money than us. that tends to be the realization. But instead, it's like, it's all of this sort of, these political, cultural divisions are just getting in the way of that.
No, that's a very sad. Yes, I mean and the pandemic has brought that out to be as obvious as the nose on your face, sort of thing. Because the virus, as we used to famously say, the virus does not care about your political affiliation or your political opinions. It's just going around infecting and killing people. So leave that all behind.
Yes.
It's not useful right now. And we need to try to find some solutions that work and try to get to the bottom of the whole thing, and we've never really gotten past that. All of a sudden it's been, are you following the science and doing all the performative COVID things, or aren't you? And that suddenly becomes a proxy opinion of your whole moral character, which I think is absolutely crazy.
Right.
And I've even said, from a branding perspective, I said if I went hard left and adopted every single left narrative and parroted it perfectly, the Cameron Journal would be more successful. But I don't. And people oftentimes struggle with the fact I have very nuanced opinions. And there are still some things I'm very conservative on. Immigration is one. That's an area where I am pretty conservative still on immigration and having, good border security and having a robust but legal immigration system. And possibly, and not necessarily doing another amnesty as we did in '86. Though that's an area where, I get pretty on. There are some topics where I can be pretty right wing. I'll own it. And immigration is the example I always use because it's easy and relatable. But there's some areas, but it's a matter of. But even within my most conservative opinion, I have this liberal idea of let's have a robust and legal and inexpensive immigration system. But I don't abide the people farther left who say, well, borders are just lines on a map, so who cares? We should have open borders. I'm like, that's a terrible idea. It's never worked in human history.
Yeah,
Never.
that's a terrible.
Not once. In 100,000 years of human
It's
history, this has never
anarcho-liberal.
worked. Yes, this has never worked.
Yeah.
So why on earth do we think we have so much hubris as to think it's going to work now? Hint, hint, it won't.
Right.
But we live in this environment where it's so dangerous to have a nuanced opinion. And that
Totally.
frighten I wouldn't say it frightens me, but it gives me pause, you know.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
yeah,
Yeah, I'm pretty
in
conservative.
your political transition, how have what have you gone in making this sort of political leap? How has it changed your relationships with people?
Oh well, I sort of I mask it a lot like at work and stuff like that. I try not to kind of go into a lot of topics, and I'll just I it's made me listen more and cringe a lot of the time when I
Mm,
listen because people will say things like, unvaccinated people, they should just die. They should just have to die because other people are dying of COVID. Unvaccinated people, they should see how they like it or whatever. They're willing to risk all these people's lives, and that was one moment where it was just like that whole friend enemy distinction really kind of like intensified for me, where it was like, oh shit, like y'all, like I do I have to move, like what, like do I need to, do I gotta go to
yeah,
Florida, like do I, like where do I go where like the people around me aren't wanting, people like me rounded up or what, or at least their imaginary, their fantasy space is sort of projecting all that kind of stuff onto me. But generally speaking, I think it's made me more value the it's made me sort of value the relationships that I have more, because if people can kind of like hear where I'm coming from and still have a conversation with me, that's so much more valuable than when I was like in Antifa and trying to like convince people to like me on some level by like sort of virtue signaling and sort of like leaning into things that I wouldn't necessarily lean into because I'm with a certain mixed company or whatever, that of people that will want me to have a certain belief, and I'm aware of that. It's that kind of that paranoia of being watched and wanting to perform for the camera or whatever, like I guess I am now. But I've loosened up on that as in my old age. I've sort of gotten to the point where I don't really care that much how people are seeing me, so I'm just sort of like, I'm the people that will still, be chill with me regardless of that, I value a lot more than the people that were judging me before, I guess.
absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. Well, we're coming up to the top of the hour, and we've been going for 2 hours, so I think everyone is tired. I could use a stand up and something stiff to drink. So why don't
All
you let
right.
people why don't you let people know where they can find you online if they want to follow you more, because you do great stuff.
Okay, cool. Yeah, Jack Genocide at Instagram. Jack with a J in genocide. Genocide spelled with a J, and yeah, Jack Genocide. Mhm.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, he does live all the time, and if you watch his lives and whatnot, you might catch me pop in from time to time. I don't necessarily always have time to do all that. Sometimes just sit and watch, but every once in a great while I'll pop on and do that. So thank you so much for coming on to the Cameron Journal podcast. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank
Have
you.
a good night.
Yes, thank you. And good night, everyone. Thank you all so much for watching. I appreciate it. If you want the audio only version of this, it will be posted here shortly this week. Otherwise, thanks everyone for watching. Have a great night.